Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining. I am so excited to be here and to be able to walk you guys through how to generate creative and compelling influencer marketing campaigns. So let's get right into it. By the end of this, my hope is that you'll be able to create concepts that both brands and influencers can get excited about. I want you to be able to know how to find influencers that match your target market, how to protect yourself from influencer fraud, why diversity and inclusion is very important, how to appropriately communicate with influencers, the best way to generate earned media, and how to let influencers be their most creative selves when creating content for you while ensuring that your brand message stays intact. So before we get into it, I want to tell you a little bit about me. I am an influencer marketing educator and expert, but I am also an influencer myself. I have been working in this space for a little over a year. I pivoted out of a career in product management, actually in technology, focusing on brand strategy. I worked at Turner Broadcasting, which is a media company that owns TBS, TNT, the NCAA, Cartoon Network, CNN. And I worked there for about 5 years before realizing that there was such a gap in education in the influencer marketing space that I got really excited about filling. So I have been working as an educator and as a consultant for a little over a year now. As an influencer, I do have my own platforms. I run a blog titled Simply Sabrina, and then I have effective social media channels across the board. My community nurtures over 500 readers and followers, particularly millennial women of color, which has been my target market. Luckily, I was named Lifestyle Influencer of the Year by Jezebel Magazine with a special focus on Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I live. And I was also a finalist for the Influencer Her Blogger of the Year award back in 2019. So it's been a very exciting ride. I've been running my blog for over 9 years, and I've learned so much being in this space, and I'm excited to share that knowledge with you guys. So first, let's talk about it. Why influencer marketing? Look, people have always trusted word of mouth marketing, and influencer marketing is just a newer and more sophisticated version of that. You have this industry that's leveraging the pull and popularity of certain people to help you spread the word about your brand. And that's something that goes back as far as time. So a couple of statistics for you guys. This is a super recent number that just came out of Adweek, really in May of 2019. And it says that based off of over 2,000 interviews with members of both cohorts, ranging from 13 to 38, 88% of millennials and Gen Z learn about new products through social media and influencers. And this is really why I wanted to get into why you need to create a business strategy around influencer marketing. Here are some other stats. I won't read them all to you. You can obviously see them for yourself. But the influencer marketing industry is on track to be worth over $15 billion by 2022, which is an important number, but it's more important when you look at it compared to what it was in 2019. So just last year, we're looking at $8 billion, and it has a trajectory of just in 3 years, doubling that number. So we are on a growth trajectory, and it is important for you and for your business to really understand the ins and outs of influencer marketing now when it's really in its growth period. And lastly, we really just care about the return, right? All good marketing has a great return on investment, and influencer marketing has shown time and time again to have that great return when done effectively. So you have this number coming out of NeoReach, who also analyzed over 2,000 campaigns, and they're talking about the earned media value, which we'll get into soon. And they're saying that for every $1 spent, you have a 5.2 times return. So that means that every dollar spent on influencer marketing results in over 5 times as many interactions with the same marketing dollar that would be spent on paid advertising. Okay, I know you know it's important. That's why you're here. And now that you're on board, let's get into it. So first, let's talk about what to create. This is something that I think is really compelling because we need to talk about how to create campaigns that gets both brands excited and also gets influencers excited. So one of the first things we need to talk about is creating compelling campaigns and creating creative campaigns. So I'm going to go into both of those. So in order to create a very compelling campaign, we need to make sure that we're reaching a very specific target audience. You also need to make sure that you're relating back to those business goals. So what is the product that you're trying to launch? What feature do you want to create buzz around? What is your new service that you guys are excited about? How can you relate back to those business goals? And then ultimately, how can you provide that high ROI? We're going to get into that in just a second. But ultimately, compelling campaigns are only as good as they are creative. So let's talk about a couple of ways that we can see creative campaigns. It's very important for you to have a pulse on what's trending. And I don't mean trending in the sense of, oh, this is like a fun viral trend. I mean trending content styles. So if you are a fashion, jewelry, really product-based brand, you should know that back in 2019, at the end of 2019, there was a really big push across all social media channels for these quick change videos. So these were created by influencers, creators who were really focusing on showing different styles in a very fast manner. So if you had someone who was maybe styling a white shirt 3 different ways, they were showing those different pieces. There was a big push with jewelry companies, cosmetic companies, for handbag companies to get in there and to be a part of that story while not taking away from the creator's initial creation. So this is something that was an example of a trending content style. Also, popular engagement features. So you have things like polls, Q&As, chat features, different ways that influencers can really communicate with their audience, and other just platform features that are coming out. So you can see on the example on the side of the screen here, you see this is from NARS, which is a very popular cosmetics company. And they took advantage of that popular engagement feature that Instagram has, which is Instagram filters. So anybody can create a filter, and they happen to create one that let a person who's trying on to virtually try on the shades of their new lipstick. It made sense for the brand, it made sense for the creator, it made sense for the fans, and it was a very great targeted on brand campaign. And you could also shop directly in Instagram for that lipstick, assuming that you liked the way you looked in it. So look, they hired influencers to help share the message about this new interactive feature that they had, which ultimately led to sales. And that's kind of what I wanted to get into right now. Let's talk about how marketers really see influencer investments. Awareness and buzz is at 90% of the value of where marketers see their investments. And that means that you're looking at influencer marketing as a top of the funnel, really that's the experience. It's a top of the funnel platform. It's a top of the funnel method in order to really be creating for consumers. So my marketing, 101 friends know this, right? You have a funnel that kind of defines, you have various steps to get you to be driven to a point of purchase or a point of sale or a point of conversion. So at the top, you have something like awareness and buzz, and then you're going to really convince people, you're going to engage with them, and then you're going to drive them at the bottom of the funnel to sales. And while there are definitely influencers in different industries that can drive sales, take a look at the chart. This is from Collectively's influencer report that came out at the end of 2019, so for 2020, and it talks about where affiliate marketing and e-commerce strategy fall for marketers. You're at 24%. And the reason it's so low on the chart is because you have to remember that influencer marketing is a top of the funnel experience. But every part of the funnel is essential, which is how it gets you to the next step, which ultimately drives to purchase. And so one of the things that you need to make sure when you're really communicating the value of influencer marketing is getting that high ROI. And here's one of the best values on how to create ROI. Look, there are at least 4 different types of value, but awareness is number 1. The next one down is content creation, which I want to get into. So here's a number coming out of Linkia's State of Influencer Marketing 2020 report. It found that 89% of marketers plan to reuse influencer content across social, website, email, and display ads. Look, being on so many platforms means you need content, and who better to create content than someone who is specialized in their field, who already works with a photographer, videographer, creates their own content, edits their content, has a reliable presence, knows how to communicate, all of these things that you would need. I mean, let's look at the big scope of it, right? You know, to create content, you need a stylist, a photographer, an editor, a copywriter. You are getting all of the value of this plus the marketing dollars in this content creation. And that's why influencer marketing is so effective. Now, I can't move on without telling you that if you do plan to reuse any influencer's content, you need to be sure that that is included in the terms of your influencer agreement. Influencers are smart and they know that content rights cost additional money. So whatever it is that you plan to use your content for outside of the scope of the original creation of the influencers creating it, putting it on their own channels, if you plan to use it, especially if you plan to put paid behind it, you need to make sure that you outline those terms. I go into this in a lot of detail in my course. So we talk about licensing terms, how long you plan to use it, is it in perpetuity, how is that going to work, are you using it for paid, display, digital, how do those influencer terms, those licensing terms work for influencers? And then also on the back end, how do you make sure that your contracts are very specific in those? So this is something that's really important. Again, I won't get into it in a lot of detail, but please know that while this is an amazing way to generate additional ROI, and I do think reusing influencer content is essential, you do need to make sure that that's included in the scope of work, so that you are very clear with the influencer on how you plan to use their content. Okay, so we're good there. Now we know it's important. We know we need to create. Let's talk about how to ideate. So I want to talk about ideation from two different perspectives. So the first one is really giving you insight into an influencer's perspective on how to ideate. So if I'm an influencer and I am focusing a lot on home right now because I just renovated my 1970s house, and I want to work with an audience and with a brand that I think will really resonate well. Maybe I'm a fan of the brand, maybe I've been using it for a really long time and I would love to work with them. So I'm going to ideate on an influencer campaign that I would love to work with the brand on. So how would I do that? At its core, we're going to get into those 5 basic questions: the who, what, when, where, and how. So I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly, but stay with me. So as an influencer, I need to know, what is my follower demographic? Any influencer that you want to work with needs to know exactly who they're reaching, what they look like, what their gender is, what their ethnicity is, how old they are, where they live, how much money they make. An influencer needs to know exactly who the demographic is of their audience. And if they don't know that, that's something that they need to figure out before they even begin to work with brands. Ultimately, they need to know what content style is effective, right? Is this somebody who can create video content? Is this someone who can create graphics? Is this someone who can create, a photo series? Or is this someone who is great at copywriting, right? Are they a blogger who does long form work? Or are they just someone who's good at posting, an Instagram picture? You need to really figure out what the content style is that you're comfortable with and what you can deliver results on. And then also as an influencer, they need to define what the campaign duration is, right? If I'm focusing on home this month, but I only focus on it the first week of every month, you need to kind of establish, look, when is this influencer going to have room in their content calendar to push this out that makes sense for them and in an authentic way. Then they need to know where, right? So where is this content going to live? Is it going to live on their blog? Is it going to live on a more temporary platform like an Instagram story? Are you looking for something that's more evergreen, that's going to live on something like a YouTube video with high searchability? Or is this going to be something that's on TikTok that's going to kind of get buried as additional content gets created? And lastly, how. Any influencer that you work with needs to know how their audience engages. They need to know, and they need to be able to communicate with you that, hey, likes aren't huge with my audience. They love to just scroll and stop. They're not big on the double tap, but they always DM me their product questions and I always respond to them. That has so much more value than a meaningless like. Okay, next. So now let's get into the target market. This is what the who looks like for a brand. Any brand, before you start a ideation for a campaign, you need to know what your target market is as a brand, who your customer persona is, and how you can translate that into finding the right influencer for you. You also need to figure out what. It is not enough to say, hey, I love to work with influencers, I just want to promote my business. It doesn't work that way. What is your keystone product or service? When you try to talk about everything, you end up talking about nothing. So being very specific on what your keystone product or service is. The when. So what does your timeline look like? What is the product launch? How does that fit in with what you want to do? Are you going to launch 5 influencers all on the first of the month? Or are you going to launch 5 influencers for the 5 Mondays coming up and see how those campaigns play out? Really, this is about creating that timeline. And then, of course, the where, right? So what platform makes the most sense for you? Are we going towards a more younger demographic? Are we going, targeting Gen Z on TikTok? Or are we going on a platform with an older audience that has a higher income? Are we focusing more on Facebook? This is really important. And lastly, the how. Your key messaging is essential. This is going to be how you ensure that your influencer is touching on all of the points that are important to you, and also keeping that brand message very close and very structured around their content. Now, I know that this is a lot, but I want to especially focus on, from a brand's perspective, what that bottom section looks like, because we're going to revisit this when we talk about brand briefs. Okay, now that we know what we're going to create, let's talk about who to work with. So defining your target market is very important. If you want to work with influencers, you first need to figure out who you want to reach. So from your brand's perspective, what does your ideal customer look like? For this, you really need to work on creating a customer persona. So here's an example. We have a couple of full examples of this and what people look like in our course. But just to give you guys a high level overview, you need to be asking questions about your demographic, your psychographics, their preferences, personality traits, right? Who is your target market? Do they have children? Where do they live? What is their age? How much money are they making? What are their hobbies? What are their fears? Who are they already following? What does a day in the life look like for them? What brands are they interested in? These are all things that you need to ask yourself when building a customer persona. Okay, once you have your customer persona, you need to find influencers that match that customer persona. So let's talk about influencer classifications. Now, these titles do vary by industry, and I do have to give a caveat that not everyone in the industry will agree with these numbers. But after my team reviewed over 24 different sources, we agree that this is the best way to categorize influence right now. And again, that may change in a while. Now, here's a little bit of the hard part. We're going to focus on follower count here, but in about a second, I'm going to get into why follower count may not be the best way. But as a high level and a place to start, let's go over these. So you have a nano influencer with a follower count somewhere around 5 to 10. Then you have a micro influencer who's about 10 to 50K, mid-tier 50 to 250, macro anyone from 250 to 500,000, mega anyone who's reaching up to 1 million, and then celebrity level, so someone who's from like 1 to 5 million. Here's what you need to know. Brands are going small. So it's reported that influencers with 20,000 to 250,000 followers deliver a 30% better ROI per dollar spent than macro influencers. Engagement rates do happen to go down as influence numbers go up. That's just normal. But you're looking at a stat that's telling you that there's 20% better with influencers with a smaller audience and people with over 1 million followers. So take it with a grain of salt. There's so much information about micro influencers. I actually have an entire workshop on why we should focus on micro influencers, but we'll save that for another time. Okay, so now that we know these levels of influence, I did mention that we have to caveat this by saying that while that's a good way to kind of structure people, it's not everything, and we definitely need to take it with a grain of salt. Because while follower count could be a determining factor, it doesn't mean that that's how much influence that the person has, and frankly, it is a number that is commonly falsified. And I'm going to get into that. Okay, first we need to talk about this. Engagement rate. What people are going to tell you is that don't focus on the follower count. Follower count can be fake. Engagement rate is where you need to focus, because engagement rate is going to tell you how engaged an influencer's audience is. That's not true anymore. I hate to be the person to tell you, but it's so important that you know engagement rate is a dated metric. This was 100% true 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, But now engagement rate is a dated metric. And that's because marketers are increasingly aware that influencers are at the mercy of mysterious platform algorithms, and things are subject to change at any point, especially when you're doing sponsored content, especially when you're using those disclaimers that of course you have to use. So that hashtag ad, that hashtag sponsor, it is very common practice that Instagram and platforms are throttling the reach in order to encourage putting paid dollars behind that influencer's content. So engagement rate is dated, and this number tells you straight up why. So in 2019, engagement rate was the fourth most important criteria for partner selection, and only 50% of marketers see it as very important. Now that's already powerful, but now you know that this is the 58% decrease from the previous year. So marketers are getting smarter. They know that engagement rate is dated, but they also know that it can be falsified. And I'm gonna get into that in a second. So let's talk about influencer fraud. This is one of the most important things that you should take away from any influencer marketing workshop, training, or education that you have. And it's something that not enough people are talking about. Influencer fraud is very, very, very real, and it is very wrong, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. And as marketers and business owners, it is your job to be knowledgeable about what's happening, to be smart, and to be able to protect your business. So I'm going to tell you something that a lot of people just aren't talking about, specifically not influencers, but you need to know. So I want to quickly pull your attention to this graphic that I pulled off of a website. This was updated in 2020. It's actually a very reputable company. And it's talking about how you should measure engagement rate and why engagement ratio is so important. The reason I wanted to pull this out is really just to talk about the lack of quality information that's out there. And it's just because people on the outside who are not a part of the influencer space from a personal perspective just don't have insight into how these things work. And I want to be the first to tell you that this is one of the reasons why I got into this space. I am so passionate about protecting brands. I think that influencer marketing is one of the most effective forms of communication, but only one done accurately. I have an entire module in my course dedicated, I think it's 30 or 40 slides long. It goes into extreme depth about different types of influencer fraud, how to save yourself, how to protect your brand, what to ask influencers for, how to vet them. This is something I'm extremely passionate about because this is the information that's out there. I'll read this quote. It says, "This higher engagement ratio is almost impossible to fake and has a clear indication that this influencer has taken the time to build up an organic and loyal following." And that's just not true anymore. And I hate to say it, but it's not. Here's a couple of reasons why, because I feel like you need to know so that if people ask you why we're not focusing on engagement rate, you have answers. So number one, with the removal of visible likes from Instagram, marketers and agencies don't have access to that like data. So you know that in 2019, Instagram started pulling likes. So from certain brand accounts, you'll see, hey, Sabrina and others liked this photo, or Sabrina and thousands of others liked this photo. So there isn't a lot of value on how many likes a picture is getting. So if you don't have access to that data, already it's difficult for you to kind of make decisions on who to work with based on that. The second reason, and honestly, I think the second reason is what influenced the first reason. At its core, customer behavior has changed and consumer behavior has changed. Think about your own phone. How many times are you scrolling through, and how many times do you stop to double tap something? It doesn't mean that something didn't get your attention. It doesn't mean it didn't catch your eye. It doesn't mean you didn't stop to observe it, but we're just getting less actionable on how we consume content, and people are continuing to scroll, which is why numbers like reach and impressions are so much more important than engagement rate, because consumer behavior has just shifted, and that's why likes just aren't that important anymore. And lastly, what you need to know is that sophisticated bot services now promise a certain number of likes and comments and sometimes even views per post when influencers engage their services. In fact, I got an email this morning and I screenshotted it because I wanted to put it into this presentation, but I just didn't have the time. But it was from a company that promised for $50 a month to give me 1,000 likes per image that I post. It promised 200 comments per image that I post, and it promised a number of views if I posted any videos. $50 a month. These are not real numbers, and you need to protect your brand because the cost of fraud is so much more than you think. Last August, Adweek reported that nearly $1.3 billion will be lost in influencer fraud in 2019. Look, you're looking at other challenges as well. You have, indirect costs, you have loss of trust, loss of credibility as a brand, and you need to make sure that you have protected yourself. So like I mentioned, we go into this in depth in my course, but I can't in good faith move on without telling you just a little bit. So here are some of the types of influencer fraud that I want you to be mindful of. You have falsified engagement, an inflated follower count, participation in loop giveaways, and the use of comment pods and bot services. Now, again, so much more detail later if you're interested, but there are also ways to make sure that influencers not only haven't done this in the past, but won't participate in this in the future. And that's to put clauses into your contracts. So reach out to me if you're interested. My course goes into all of this, but at a high level, this is how you spot influencer fraud. Check their feed, check their likers. So those are the people who like the images. Click on that. Check their likes, check their comments, check their views, check their analytics, and then use a third-party tool. Okay, I feel better. I feel like I shared this very important message. So let's get on. We need to be careful. So let's talk about how to find those influencers. Let's talk about influencer seeding. So look, there's 3 ways to do influencer seeding. There's manual, third party, and agencies. So there are ways to go about this, a couple of different ways. I highly recommend that if you are going to use a third party, which means you're kind of seeding influencers through different search tools, that you also go ahead and do a manual search. Look, nobody knows your audience better than you do, and that people who are already your fans. So ask your audience, use the suggested influencer section. I have a little screenshot of this here. This is in TikTok, but the suggested accounts are going to show you accounts with a similar following and similar content style to the account that you're seeing. So if you already know that there's somebody you want to work with, take a look and see what else the platform is recommending. When you use someone like an agency, you will be paying a premium, but you will probably have a more hands-off approach. So there's pros and cons to that. It's really about you. My focus is on educating in-house brands and agencies on how to use influencer marketing better. So these are all great options. You just have to pick what makes the most sense for you. I am happy to say that I have gotten so much interest in my section and my course on my entire module on diversity and inclusion in the last couple of weeks. And it's amazing because I've created this content, I've delivered workshops on this in the past, and now there's so many more marketers and companies who are interested and want to listen. So I think that this is so important, and I really encourage you guys to include diversity and inclusion initiatives within your influencer marketing numbers. At its core, you should always choose influencers who are representative of your brand and who match your target audience. We already know that. But just remember that influencers are not billboards. They are not models. They are people, and they are going to have opinions, and they reflect your target market. So prioritize working with influencers who represent who you want as customers, not only how they look, which is extremely important, but who you are as a brand. And that means paying very special attention to diversity and inclusion. Look, diversity includes a number of things. So we're not just talking about ethnicity, we're not just talking about race, but we're talking about sexual orientation, if your product is gender neutral, different body types, different sizes, socioeconomic status, physical abilities, religious beliefs. All of these things are just considered diversity, which makes people different from one another. Look, the importance of diversity marketing goes beyond avoiding consumer backlash, which is what you saw a lot of in the beginning of June in 2020. But it's not because it's the politically correct thing to do or because you want to check a box. This is important because representative tells a very powerful brand story. And look, representation matters over tokenism. If you have 7 tall, skinny Caucasian women and 1 Black woman, that should not represent what your brand is about. Having a token minority is not enough. And when influencer brand campaigns show more diversity, diverse followers feel more associated with the brand and therefore are more likely to try products that influencers recommend and then recommend them to their friends. Ultimately, you want that earned media. You want people talking about your brand, about how amazing it is, about how inclusive it is. So it starts with you, and know that representation is more important than tokenism. Also, it's important to mention that creating a one-off timely post around Pride or around Black History Month may fall on deaf ears if you're not showing that same support throughout the year. Audiences are watching as brands speak out about social justice issues, things like pride, gay rights, anti-racism, and many brands will face and are already facing scrutiny over their actions. Business practices have hurt people of color, and lack of diversity, especially in marketing efforts, are a big part of that. We need to take responsibility of it and be more actionable about how we move forward, specifically in our marketing efforts. Because at the end of the day, your brand has a permanent record. It doesn't matter if you post a black square if the rest of your feed looks like this. And I cannot tell you how easy it was to find this screenshot. It took me about 3 seconds, and I probably could have found 10 more. This is a quote from Bitch Media. This is coming out actually in January of 2020, because diversity and inclusion practices within influencer marketing have been so important well beyond the middle of 2020. This came out in June, because at the end of what we're seeing is that brands want to zone in and focus on capitalizing on those human relationships that influencers have created. Because remember that celebrities were the first influencers, right? These were people who were photographed walking down the street, and people said, "Oh, what are you wearing? What shoes are those? What hat is that? What sunglasses are those?" And when people started to see the value in influencer marketing, they started to see that people wanted to see people who looked more like them. They wanted to see people in different sizes, different shapes, different ethnicities, different colors, different heights. And this is what they wanted, because they wanted to be connected with brands that look like them. And so we're coming full circle, and we're realizing that even influencer marketing has taken a shift towards celebrity marketing, and we need to bring it back down and realize why this platform is so important. Again, I go into this in depth in my course. If you're interested in a workshop on diversity and inclusion, I'm really happy to talk to you about this at another time. But I have to move on. So let's talk about communicating with influencers. This is so important, because the way that you communicate with influencers is how you are going to push the needle forward in your business. The wrong communication will result in no response, or even a response that you don't want to get, right? If you are getting blacklisted by an influencer because the way that you reached out to them because you weren't knowledgeable, this is the time to pay attention. Here's my first tip. Do not reach out to an influencer through social media and tell them that you want to partner or collaborate. The only time you should reach out to an influencer is to ask them for the best email to reach them at via social media. That's it. We don't do business over social media, especially not DMs, which is usually a place where influencers talk to their audience. It's not where they're conducting professional business. And as a professional brand, you need to be mindful of that. So let's go into a couple of the best practices. Communicating with influencers is an extremely delicate practice. Your first email and your follow-up email are going to make or break if an influencer decides to work with you. You need to be professional, you need to be respectful, and never send an influencer a product without asking if they want to receive it. You also need to make sure that your outreach is about the creator. Think about if you were headhunting and if you wanted to hire an employee. They reached out to you, that's one thing. But if you go out and seek them out, it's not fair to ask them, "Hey, I'd love to work with you. What can you give me?" Right? You need to make it about them and what you can offer them. And now this doesn't always have to be monetary. I have an entire section in my course that talks about non-monetary forms of compensation and how you can be a good partner with a small budget. So ultimately, you want this influencer to want to choose to work with you on a partnership. Stat after stat, report after report, we are seeing that influencers' biggest pain points when working with brands is feeling a generalized lack of respect for a creator's time and talent. Like I said, your initial email and follow-up will make or break if an influencer decides to work with you. You need to make sure that you're addressing them with professionalism, with courtesy, and that you're being extremely clear on the type of partnership that you want to have. So because I think this is so important, I did go ahead and create some email outreach templates. If you go to this link, it's bit.ly/TIM, that's the influencer marketer email. So Tim email, you will be able to see in-kind and gifting campaigns, an email template for that. So if you're gifting or doing product samples, any type of unpaid partnership, again, there are forms of non-monetary communication. That's super important. To be clear about. And that doesn't mean you'll write an email that will automatically get thrown into the junk. There is a right way to write that email. If you're interested in doing a paid content creation style campaign, there's a template for that. Any type of paid sponsored content creation or a long-term brand partnership, there's a template for that. And if you're just not sure yet, there's a generic outreach template. All of these are combined efforts from what I've created as an influencer, generalizing the 9 years of content that I've gotten from brands and finding the most effective ways to communicate with influencers. So again, those are completely free. If you go over to the influencermarketer.com, if they are also there, or you can just use this short link that's bit.ly/TIM email. Okay, once you have that in your arsenal, you are ready to reach out. So now we need to know how to partner. One of the things that we've talked about is earned media value, and you want to know how influencers are going to want to talk about you outside of just paying them. Here it is. Long-term relationships equal long-term success. We talked about some general marketing guidelines earlier when we talked about the funnel. So if you are a trained marketer, you know about the rule of 7. So the rule of 7 basically says that it takes 7 potential customer interactions with a brand to be driven to a point of conversion. So influencers can help with awareness, but they're more effective when they're telling that story again and again. And the way you can do that is by leveraging long-term campaigns and becoming brand ambassadors. Look, there is such a shift in this that one of the biggest influencer marketing agencies announced in May of 2024 that they will switch their entire business model only to promote brand influencers and are doing away with one-off projects. This is how you get that coveted earned media value. So earned media is at the intersection. You have paid media, owned media, and earned media. So earned media is that publicity gained through promotional efforts that aren't just paid or created by the brand. It's that online word of mouth, it's that extra conversation that you want, which really fits perfectly with influencer marketing. Aspire IQ has a really great way of explaining this. They said brands always train their ambassadors on their products and services as well as their company mission and values. Because of this, ambassadors have inside knowledge and become true brand experts. Brands and their ambassadors have always had long-term partnerships, which is why a brand ambassador is such a coveted title. Here's what's happening. When an influencer talks about a brand one time, there is very little opportunity for long-term conversions. Ultimately, what happens is that influencers, when they show that they're very passionate about a brand, they'll continue to have those conversations. In fact, 38% of influencers receive daily DMs about products that they've endorsed. You want to invest in your influencers and they will invest in your brand back. Remember that influencer marketing is another form of word of mouth advertising, and many recommendations come from influencers that are having conversations in DMs or in organic stories outside of paid campaigns. So you really want to build those brand advocates. Most of social currency for online influencers is in the form of trust, and long-term partnerships just help push that message because it shows how much the influencer is willing to invest in the brand. The goal of an effective influencer marketing campaign is really just to humanize the brand and to make it genuine. Okay, so you want an influencer to choose you back. You've found your influencer, you know what idea you have, you've reached out to them. How do you get them to choose you back? One of the biggest things that influencers want when it comes to a brand partnership is creative freedom. And there was a survey from CrowdTap in 2020 that talked about how this was what influencers outlined as their favorite thing about working with brand partners. You absolutely must give influencers the right to create content that matches their voice, their brand, and their creativity, because this is why you chose them in the first place. The last thing you want is for it to look like an ad, right? Influencers know their audience the best. You need to let them decide how content will best relate to their audiences. Offering influencer creative control allows them to represent your product in a manner that's authentic, and that is what you can do to ensure a successful partnership. At the end of the day, influencers just want to create something that's effective and valuable to their audience and really just fits in line with their personal brand. So give them context and get out of the way. Marketers need to trust creators as subject matter experts and as experts on taste and interests of their own audience. I know what you're thinking. This is great, but I have a boss and I need to make sure that this influencer doesn't go rogue and that they know what the message is and that it gets through very clearly. So how do you ensure accuracy? Two ways. You have brand briefs or briefing calls, preferably both. And then on the flip side, you have draft approvals. This happens before you have the creator create content and before the influencer post content. In my course, I have an entire timeline where we go through communication, what days, what type of content should be due, what you're communicating with them, how you're reaching out to them to say, hey, this is what I need on this day. And all of the details around communication and asking for this type of content, and also including it in your contract and in your influencer agreement before you even have them create content. You need to make sure that you sign an influencer agreement to protect you and to protect the influencer. Okay, I'm getting off topic. Let's get back into brand briefs. So brand briefs need to include a document, preferably a PDF, that you send to the influencer to get them to understand what your focus is of the submission. This should ideally be it could be slides, anywhere from 5 to 10 slides. It could be a PDF document, but I highly recommend getting on the phone with influencers to walk them through it. This is usually done when I would do it with brands. I usually schedule a 10 or 15-minute call. I send them the document in advance and I say, hey, these are all the things. Can you please look over it in advance and then let's talk about it. This way you really get to understand what the influencer's idea is. And this is an opportunity for you to ask them to help you understand what their idea is. Say, okay, now that you've seen all this and you've had some time, I'd love to know what you're thinking in terms of creation. And that way you are ready and prepared for what they're going to create. On the screen, I won't read it out to you, but it's a list of some of the things that your brand brief needs to include. And again, we have some examples of this in my course, but reach out to me if you're interested and we can help get you some of that. On the flip side, once this is done, you need to talk about draft approvals. So we have the brand brief, we've talked to them, we know what they're supposed to create, now they've created. Before it goes live, you need to have time to review. If you are doing a paid partnership with an influencer, you should always have a briefing call or document. Ideally, you should do both. And this is something that you need to make sure that you get that on the flip side of it, that approval. So this usually goes out about, you ask for that content 10 business days before the go live date, and you should return that approval or approved with revisions or rejected within 5 days of that go live date. Look, draft approvals are not the time to reconsider your campaign message and add in requirements for influencers. That is why that brand brief was so important. That's why your agreement is so important. But this is the time to make sure, check, it looks good. We did spelling, we did grammar, disclosures are there, everything is spelled right, the brand is mentioned properly, check, check, check. All right, I hope that this was not too much information. If you are interested in any of the tools and resources that I talked about here, I'm more than happy to help connect you. We do have those free email outreach templates at bit.ly/TIM email. That's also at theinfluencermarketer.com. This is an overview of those 5 different free templates that you're going to get. And it also gives you kind of an outline on how to formulate that email in any type of influencer outreach program. So if you're interested in any additional information, this is the services that I offer. I do both virtual and in-person training and workshops. There's some popular influencer workshop topics including the true ROI of influencers, how to determine what type of influencer is right for your brand, any type of influencer seeding outreach, legal clients. I also do talks. So this is about how to protect yourself from influencer fraud, tackling diversity, relationship building, and then also, again, that ROI and how to get that earned media value. And ultimately, consulting services. I know for a lot of companies, investing in a third party to take over all of their partnerships is not ideal. And also, just getting the bandwidth to hire one extra person to to do this isn't great either. So what I do is I work with your in-house team to create a program that's sustainable, that your team is able to manage. And then there's some popular services listed there. So if you want to talk, I'm Sabrina Molu, the influencer marketer. These are some of my handles and where you can find me. This was such a pleasure, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.